Welcome to the Angler's Wisdom Podcast,
supercharged by Amped Outdoors Lithium.
Today, anglers fish longer. Today, anglers fish harder. Today, anglers rely more than ever on their electronics. It all comes down to catching more fish, and today, anglers rely on Amped Outdoors lithium batteries, period.
catch more fish,
Learn tips, tricks,
techniques, and secrets, and decades of angler's wisdom. Welcome to the show.
Oh, yeah! Yeah! Oh!
Oh, that's a nice one.
Yeah!
What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another action-packed episode of the Angler's Wisdom Podcast. We've got a great show lined up for you today, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss this one. Before we dive in, a quick reminder, if you're watching live, drop your questions in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on it, and you might just get your questions answered live during the show. And if you haven't already, make sure you hit the like, share, and subscribe button, and turn the notification bells on so you never miss a new episode. Now, let's get into it. So today's guest is someone who's been making waves in the fly fishing community for decades. Whether you're into steelhead fishing, two-hand casting techniques, or exploring the diverse fisheries of the Great Lakes, this episode's for you. Joining us will be Jeff Liskay, excuse me, a seasoned guide and instructor based on the south shore of Lake Erie in Avon Lake, very close to me. Jeff has been chasing steelhead for nearly 4 decades, fishing not only across Great Lakes, but also in Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, where the official steelhead are, even though our eggs come from there. He's a Patagonia fly fishing ambassador and operates Great Lakes Fly Fishing LLC, offering a full range of guided and instructional services focused on Lake Erie's south shoreline and tributaries, as well as Lake St. Clair. Jeff is also recognized for his expertise in two-hand casting and a regular presenter at spay gatherings. Sorry, I'm just learning the fly fishing stuff. But anyways, let's not waste any time. Let's go ahead and bring Jeff on. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Hey, thanks for the invite, Chuck. Way cool, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on. So before we get started, why don't you just kind of tell us a little bit about yourself?
Like you, Chuck, I've been born and raised right here on the south shores of Lake Erie. And I don't think I planned on getting into, deep diving into angling as much as I have, but it just sort of happened that way. Started back in the early 70s, and I basically just happened to have a buddy and I that had a little passion of going down Rocky River and trying to catch whatever was there. And then eventually there was a bait shop called the Tackle Box that opened up across the street from one of the Lakewood, Ohio's middle school. And I ended up being like a shop rat, started working there scooping minnows. And then, as you know, you just got done talking about, seeing your reps. There was always people in the industry, and it just grew from there. And it just kept going and going and going. And here I am 40 some years later, and I'm still have the passion, man.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. I was trying to find an old picture of the Tackle Box, but I'm sure there's one floating around there somewhere, but I couldn't seem to find it. But it brought up an interesting thought. When we were kids, that's what we did. We hung out at the tackle shop when we weren't fishing, right? And that's where we met, fellow anglers and mentors and people that influenced us into the sport, and I thought about it. I'm like, I don't really see a whole lot of young anglers hanging around in tackle shops anymore. Am I like missing them, or does it seem like that's kind of the way that the trend is going, and why are they utilizing YouTube more? Is it more of like that's where they're getting their influence and their information versus like hanging out at the tackle and the tackle shop, which for anybody that's hung out in a tackle shop, it's incredibly valuable.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think everything is at your fingertips now, right? You just you pick up the phone and they can basically, your learning curve is much shorter. They don't even have to do, watch it on TV. It's all on their phone. And I think it's a great asset for everybody. But and there's also, fewer and fewer tackle shops, fewer and fewer fly shops, but in our geographic area, Craig Lewis, over there at Erie Outfitters, that is still a hive of the top 10% anglers coming in and out of there, and the traveling anglers and everything else. So that's sort of the little hive when it comes down to gear angling. And of course, the backpackers shop on the west side there, that's just the little beehives that people come in. But I have seen a little more influx of, like ourselves, like you're not even old enough to drive, and you got your backpack, you got your rod hanging out the backpack, and you're, running your bike around. But I have been seeing some local young anglers with their pedaling their bikes down to the retention ponds on the development. So it's not completely dead, but it's nothing like we've experienced, Chuck.
Yeah, I feel like they're still getting out there. I'm always seeing kids out there fishing, just like you, riding down the street on a bicycle with their backpack and their tackle and everything. I was just kind of curious because, along the years, you realize like that's an extremely valuable resource to anybody getting into fishing. There's stuff that's talked about there that you're not going to hear anywhere else, especially on the internet, right?
Right. You get that under the QT's talk, right?
Yep. Yeah. So everybody listening, definitely make it a point to support your local bait and tackle shop. These are the people that they give back to the community and they influence the community and the fishery. So we got to keep them around, and maybe try to direct some young people in there to pick up some angler's wisdom along the way. So Jeff, you've been fishing, fly fishing legend for decades. What was the moment that made you realize fishing was your true calling?
That's a really good question, Chuck. I would think I'm a puzzle solver, and I played football, don't get me wrong, but there's something about fishing that you get out when you're younger, when you're real young, and then of course life, commitments get in your way, you discover girls and you sort of get away from it. But fishing's for life. You're not going to play tackle football when you're in your 60s or 70s or 50s, so it's for life. You might wander back and forth, but I never lost the passion. And I think it's that you can never learn it all in your lifetime, right? It's just that never learning. Every day we're on the water, it's like, man, I learned something again today. So that's just that never ending, like, to stay like, why did that happen? Like the days you get skunked, right? You're like, what just happened?
Exactly. Especially on the Great Lakes, there's so many different moving parts, and each year is totally different and different variables. Like this year, we're going to be, what are they saying, about a foot lower than the water level's been. So it's, always keeps you on your toes.
Yeah, right. Boat launching ramps with where the fish were spawning when the water was high. Now it's dry ground. It's just it's a never ending cycle of what I call, like, finding the magic key for the day, the week, the month, and then of course the year.
Yep. Well, what do you think makes Lake Erie such a special fishery? Because you've been all over fishing in some pretty incredible fisheries. What separates Lake Erie from them, and what's kept you here your whole life?
I think Lake Erie, of course. I wouldn't want to live in central Ohio. Not that they don't have great fishing, but Lake Erie is the shining star of Ohio. That's what I feel. But I just been blessed that I was born here. But within that geographic area in northern Ohio, within 8 hours drive, there's not a species I cannot pursue, from Atlantic salmon to all 5 Pacific salmon. coastal rainbows, anything you want to talk about. I can't quite get to the migratory big brook trout to go up on the Nipigon. That's around 10, 12 hours, but it's definitely, what I call home. I like that. And then I think Lake Erie is so diverse. Every freshwater species that, warm water is in the lake. And with a short drive away, we can get into some muskies on St. Clair. So it's just, there's not a river I haven't fished, and there's probably not a cove or a nook or cranny, even on the Canadian side, that I haven't visited at least once or twice. So, and I'm still learning, right? And still getting my ass kicked.
Yeah, we all do. But if we didn't, we probably wouldn't come back every time, right?
Yeah,
it would get boring after a while.
Exactly.
Can you share a game-changing moment in your career that shaped the way you approach fly fishing?
I think I'm pretty successful as a fly angler only because of the multiple years of conventional fishing, in regards to that. If we have a standard lure that we troll or we cast, it has somewhat of a built-in action and a vibration. And understanding, even as an angler, we still have to manipulate that lure once in a while to get it to catch fish. Well, I think that grassroots from the very beginning and still today lets me understand what a fly needs to do to catch a fish. Does it need to have a vertical drop? Does it have to hover? Does it have to go fast or slow? And it's just understanding that most fly anglers, they think their dominant hand that they cast with is the most important, and that's the farthest thing from the truth. It's your non-dominant hand that's manipulating that line and stripping it or pausing it. The pause is the cause, as we all know. And I think that was the thing that was like, man, this is not easy, right? The casting's not easy. The retrieve's not easy. Then, of course, you dive into making your own, flies. I used to make my own lures. Now I'm, making my own flies. So I think it's just that next level, a little bit of a challenge. That's all for me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I didn't make that connection, but I'm calling me a greenhorn on the fly fishing side of things is probably saying too much. But that's an interesting concept, because when you're fly fishing, you're performing all those acts to create that action versus if you're casting or you're trolling, the bait's doing a lot of the action for you.
Yeah. And think about this way too, Chuck, is that you're directly connected to the fish when you're stripping the fly and the fish hits it. You're holding the line at the same time. It's not, it's not going to be wound on an open face or a level wind. And you feel it hit, you strip it in. But the real main difference is even when you're playing the fish, is that we have this one little obstacle, is that when the fish, once you get it on the reel and you get the slack, out onto your fly reel, that the handle still spins. It's not like a spinning reel where we can hold the handle and the drag spool moves and we have a lot of leeway. Well, blame me, with a fly rod, it's a lower ratio in the reel, and you have a hard time sometimes of just landing fish as a beginner. There's a little bit of a learning curve with that too.
Yeah, I could see that, because you're basically putting pressure on the spool to kind of create a makeshift drag system to fight the fish.
Yeah, correct. If you have a drag system on most of the reels, are really good, but as you know, we always wanted to have it a little bit on the loose side where we can either pinch it against the cork, but on fly reels, like you said, we can add that little extra pressure just before we want to land the fish right on that, palming it on the back of that reel spool of the fly reel.
That makes sense. What do you think the biggest misconceptions about fly fishing in the Great Lakes are?
Well, I would think that most anglers in our geographic area, we do not have this vibrant trout fishery, right? Because the trout world basically keeps the entire fly fishing world afloat financially. But in Ohio here, most anglers start out with, trying to dabble into the steelhead fishery that runs in here on the south shores of Lake Erie or New York and Ontario, or whatever. And then they eventually say, well, I got this outfit. What do I do in the summer? So then they go into maybe get them in the farm pond, or they might be able to go to an inland lake. But there's really no stepping stone. But I actually think most fly anglers, when they get into it, they don't realize that it's a commitment, right? It's like, okay, just like spin fishing and trolling and everything else, it's like first you got to learn how to cast to make your day easier. And I think that's where, and you can't incorporate casting and fishing in the same day when you're a beginner. You have to dedicate, like, today I'm going to spend 35 minutes, while the dog's out in the yard doing its business, and I'm going to go and practice my fly rod. Because if you become an efficient caster, then you can be a more efficient angler. And then I think most people consider fly fishing with a floating line and, surface poppers, or using split shots and an indicator to river drift for some steelhead around here. But within the last 15 years or 20 years, and especially in the last maybe 8 years, today's modern fly lines, I'm fishing down as far as 42 feet on a cast. So it's opened up a whole nother spectrum of the expectations of what a fly angler can do on the Great Lakes.
That's incredible. I never realized you could do that. Well, I kind of understand a little bit more about fishing from shore, fly fishing from shore now. When you're out there targeting like the steelhead along the shoreline, I was wondering how you were going to get your baits down that deep.
Well, so in today's fly world, everybody has a floating line, and then we're just going to use it as a base platform for like streamer fishing, not for trout fishing. This would be for our geographic area, a 7-weight rod. You have, I would say, over 100 choices of line you can put on that 7-weight. So imagine it goes from floating, and then if you want your fly to sink a little deeper, they have what's called a intermediate, which means the fly line will now sink 1 to 2 inches per second. And then they have another line that goes 3 inches per second, and so on. And eventually you get into lines that are full sinking or have about 30 foot of tungsten on the front of them, and they're called shooting heads. And you can, by counting that down, you can achieve, depending on how far you can cast, right? This is a logistically mathematics thing, but if you make a 60-foot cast, you can probably get down 20, 25 feet easily. Now, do you need to get that deep along the breakwall? Absolutely not.
Right.
But so the interesting thing is, you can probably, relate to this, is when you're trolling and they're pretty speed effective, like days, like especially steelhead, they don't want it that slow roll. They want to getting it going pretty fast. But a crankbait, because of the lip design, you can go fast and you can keep it at that controlled depth, say 8 feet down. That's the magic number for me, is around 8 feet down for steelhead on Lake Erie along the shoreline. Well, I would pick a sinking line or a rod weight that is heavy enough that I can keep it that depth with a very fast pace of strip, rather than having it ride way up in the water column. So that'd be like, maybe doing the analogy of comparing my sinking lines that I choose for my fly rod the way you would compare the lips of your crankbaits for depth, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All of a sudden, I want to go fly fishing.
I wouldn't recommend it.
What is your go-to setup for trophy fish on the Great Lakes?
Well, this is sort of a drawback of fly fishing, because there's a numerical system in the rods that start out realistically from a 3-weight, which would be in relationship to an ultralight in spin fishing, all the way up to a 15-weight, which would be considered like an ocean going rod, surf casting rod. But in reality, in our area, we rely on 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 weights. And if you're musky fishing, it might be an 11-weight. But in that midsection between 6, 7, and 8, that carries the bulk of my work. I would say that if you were going to start out, I would say a nice 7 weight is a really good all around rod to start with. It can get the job done with a whole lot of different species, a whole lot of different lines. Um, because the drawback with fly fishing, and this is the hard part, is that because we don't have the weight of the lure to bend the rod, we're using the weight of the line. So even if we wanted to fish for largemouth that are 1.5 pounds, but we want to throw a really big air resistant frog or something, even though the fish are only 1.5 pounds, we might have to step up to a 9 or 10 weight because we need the weight of that 8 or 9 weight to, like, mass moves mass. We need that heavy weight line to move big flies, even though the fish are small. So it's like a catch 22. But 7 weight's a pretty good weight. I carry 21 fly rods in my boat, and they're all rigged up, and I carry another 10 reels with me. So sort of like you, as many crankbaits as you've got in your box, that's probably as many fly lines I have. One of those deals.
Right. That's interesting. I never would have imagined the rod is dependent on the line and the presentation that you're planning on throwing versus like what species that you're targeting. For the most part, it's heavily dependent on the presentation. So one thing I did want to touch on just before we get off like the Great Lakes stuff is you have this thing, it's called respect the drum. And anybody that's caught a sheephead and they're not trying to fool anybody, I mean, we're always smiling when we get them into the boat. Of course, on tournament day, we're only smiling for maybe the first one, because after that, it's just it's a waste of time. But any other time, I mean, catching a sheephead or a freshwater drum is it's a great time. So I kind of wanted to talk about you offering those fly fishing trips for the drum.
I'm guilty of it. If anybody's going to get a stone thrown, it'd be throw the stone at me first, because I was guilty when I was younger, guiding in the late '70s up on Lake Erie, and in the early '80s and all through then. Is that you get a sheephead and you bang it against the gunnel of the boat, and then the seagulls get it, because it was just what I thought at that time, being inexperienced and didn't have a mentor to say don't do that. And then I realized that first off, the freshwater drum, even though sometimes it can be a little bit of a nuisance if you're in a tournament, is that the younger the year of the drum, because it's such a high density, high prolific reproducing fish in Lake Erie, is the forage for the millions of walleye and game fish that swim in Lake Erie. So it's a key component of the ecosystem. Then if you add on to that, that as a fly angler, it's probably 10 to 1, just if you're using a spinning rod to a fly rod, as far as like catch to land ratio. So it gives a fly angler a really good opportunity to catch very large fish that are relatively in shallow water, that within reason of a fly angler to cast on the break walls or out in the boat or whatever. They fight like crazy. And then for me, it's like a win-win situation for drum. I think you need to say, okay, next time you get a drum and it tangles up 6 of your lines or whatever, you like to say, hey, that thing made babies to keep the walleye factory going. So that's why I always say respect that drum. I make a pretty good living at chasing those all over. And I think once somebody gets their first or second drum, either in Rocky River in the lower end or out in Lake Erie off the break wall with a fly rod, they're like, wow, this is pretty fun.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's I can't imagine catching it on the fly rod. I mean, they're basically targeting the freshwater relative or the saltwater relative of the drum, the redfish on the flats with the fly.
Yeah, we just get a big black magic marker, right?
Right. Well, no, the redfish with the reds with the spot on the tail.
Yeah, we get a black magic marker to our
Oh yeah,
drum.
to make the spot. Yeah, I was
Yeah.
thinking
Yeah.
the stripes for the sheep's
No,
head.
yeah, no, the big red drums. You could put the big magic marker on ours, and yeah, they probably fight just as good at some of times, as you know how big they are. But it
Oh yeah.
can be a nuisance, like I say, if you're not targeting them. But
Yeah, I think one of probably the most fun fish I've caught out of the Great Lakes was what was it, 34-inch sheephead, and it was an evening fishing trip that extended into the morning. So it was like 3:30 or 4 o'clock when it hit a.m. pitch dark, and this fish just kept ripping drag, and the drag was all the way tight, but eventually got it in, and the light hit it at first. I'm like, oh my God, it's a monster walleye. And then, within a split second, we all realized it was a sheephead. But man, that was an exciting fight. I mean, even the smaller ones are a great time.
yeah, I mean, I was guiding a Presque Isle, and we're just before evening, like you. We were fishing a point. We threw, a couple clients. The one client throws at a point, and he gets a muskie follow, and we're like, there's not many in Presque Isle, right? So I was like, man, throw back in there. Strips in, throws right back in there, and the rod just buckles over. So we're all like hooping and hollering, thinking that we got this muskie. And then it started not, then we didn't see it right. It was like, well, what's going on? And it was a brutal tug of war. And when that thing came up, 38-inch plus, sheephead, we're like, I thought he would be disappointed, but after everything was all said and done, when he seen it was like the size of those old galvanized garbage can lids, was like, that's a cool fish.
Oh yeah, that's pretty awesome. The muskie would have been cool, but I mean, not everybody catches a what was it, 30, 36, 38 inch?
Oh, it was over 36. It was probably,
Wow,
yeah, it was the biggest one I've ever caught. It had a big dolphin tail on that thing, man. It was awesome.
that's pretty awesome. So you're renowned for your expertise in two-handed casting. Maybe you can kind of break down what is two-handed casting and also what makes it such an effective technique for species like steelhead.
You know, I started, and my mentors were in the Canadian side of Lake Erie. Is how I got involved with this two-handed casting. People call it spey casting, but in general, a spey rod is, and there's what's called a switch rod too. So let's just talk a little bit about the rods first. So a standard fly rod is anywhere from 7 foot to 9 foot, and then you have this specialty rods, which like a steelhead rod is like anywhere from 9 to 10 foot long. And then in general speakings, they have another terminology that fly rods that are from 11 foot to 12 foot are either crossover, short spey rods, or switch rods. And then any rod that's over 12 foot is considered a dedicated two-handed rod. Everybody throws the word spey around, but it just proper terminology is it's a dedicated two-handed rod over 12 foot. I got involved with it because when you start to travel destination steelhead fishing, there's a lot of areas that are catch and release that won't allow you to use conventional gear. And I was unable to get the distance I needed with a single hand rod without, because you have to have back casting room. So the space systems and that we use around here are not as big as it would be on the West Coast or when you're big destination fishing. It's generally a switch rod. And they actually have the weights that the same as a single hand rod. So we have anywhere from a switch rod, which is a 5 weight, 6 weight, 7 weight, and 8 weights. And those are sort of what's popular in our area. And there's an extended, we have normally on a normal fly rod, we have this extension on our butt once you get to be around a 7 weight rod. Well, imagine extending the rear section of the grip behind the reel another 3 or 4 or 5 inches. And that allows you to place your non-dominant hand on the bottom of that. And so you use it as a lever. So normally you would only have one hand on this fly rod. Now you have two And over time, a couple seasons, you realize that you can use your bottom hand because it doesn't come easy, and it just makes the casting more effortlessly. And you don't get the shoulder fatigue. You can cast farther. Is the rods a little heavier? Sure, absolutely. But because you have two hands on them, it's not that. Now, I will go on record saying that when you use these rods, you can use them in a dead drift fashion for indicator fishing like you normally would. But most anglers that dive into this is called a swung fly presentation. So you're going to be throwing your fly across the river, and then it sort of swings across like you would if you just casted a spoon across, and it wobbles across from the far bank to the near bank. Well, that's basically what's called a swung fly presentation. And rather than fishing parallel with the current, you would with an indicator or dead drifting down, high sticking, you actually are going to be against the current, and then you take a step down. The tricky part is that steelhead are stationary, and most of the time they like to be spoon fed once they get in the river. So the dead drifting presentation is highly, highly more effective than a swung fly. So it's not a more effective, it's more efficient to covering water. It's a little bit less fatiguing, but it's not as effective because you're looking for that super aggressive fish. You're looking for what we call the player. It would be like that when you drop your lure and you're trolling, it's the most aggressive fish out of the school chasing it. That's sort of what we're looking for the steelhead. We're looking for the bully of the pack that's in the run. And I think it's the direct connection of when that fly is swimming through the water column or ticking along the bottom, and that fish, you don't see the indicator or the bobber go down. You basically feel that fish connect right with you, through the fly line and onto your hand. And then you're like, oh, okay, that fish just murdered that fly, or it just barely hitchhiked onto that fly. It does have a couple of different lines and terminologies. One is called a Scandinavian system. But just for the podcast, we're going to talk about a Skagit system. The Skagit system is a very, very short fly line. It's like a bullet. We call it like a projectile. It's not even really like a standard fly line that you're used to, like 64 feet. These little short little lines that go on these, these switch rods are anywhere from 12 feet up to 21 feet. So they're very short. The reason why they're short is because we add on the sinking mechanism, what's called a sink tip. And basically it's about a 10 or 12 foot long section of monofilament or braided cord that's coated with tungsten that has different sink rates. And so if you can use the analogy that this sink tip is sort of like the split shots for the swung fly game. And depending on how, just like if you went from one split shot to 5, you would get snagged at 5 and you won't get to the bottom in 1. So 3 is the magic number to get down in the river to make it just right without snagging. That's sort of the game we play when these tips are removable, and we change these sink tips, and they range from 1 to 2 inches per second to 8 inches per second. And it can get pretty complicated, but in general rule, for any of you anglers that are looking to, like, I have a switch rod, I really don't know what to do to get down. If you just use the terminology that we call it T material, the T stands for tungsten, and then there's a number behind it, which is there's T8, T10, T11, 12, all the way up to 18, 22. But that number behind that T is how much that weighs per foot in grains. But to make the mathematics sink really easy, or for you to understand, it's if we have 200 and we have 55 grains of weight, of any type of weight on our end of our fly line, that's going to be a really good indicator for you to start with in the rivers in Ohio that flow on average flow, if that makes sense. And we can get into a lot deeper. We can get into the weeds, Chuck, but that's the basics.
Yeah, that's great. That's pretty interesting. I think I'll just I'll come out with you the first time.
Yeah.
and figure it out, because my mind's spinning a little bit.
Yeah, it's a lot, man. It is really a lot.
And it's totally different than like traditional fishing, you know, because everything's kind of like backwards in a way, but more challenging and complicated, you know, kind of like the line and the rod thing.
Yeah, right. Think about all it basically is we're throwing crankbaits. We're throwing big, bigger, brighter flies or dark flies, and we're using. It's like you swinging a crankbait, quick fish, flat fish. That's sort of the same exact thing.
What advice would you give somebody struggling with spay casting or looking to get into?
I would think the first thing is that refine your casting a little bit. Work on your casting when you get a chance. I think the next thing to do is understanding that the water temperature is gonna dictate how these fish will move to a fly or even an artificial lure rather than a dead drift. So if the water's super cold, which is say 38 and under, that you need to make sure you're within a foot of the bottom, because these fish are not able, because they're cold-blooded, the steelhead can't just go up to the surface and chase your fly or your lure, whatever. So you got to get down and dirty with them, so that the depth is going to be really critical. You're going to try to manipulate and mend that line, on the sort of water to slow it down as slow as you can. But eventually, when that water peaks up over 40, 42, and gets closer to 50 and more, these fish will actually come up off the bottom, and you don't have to be as critical. So be pretty critical on, the speed of the fly and how deep you get it when you do it. But first off is get the casting down. That's the hard part.
Yeah, and there's some great resources in the area that people can attend, to meet fellow fly fishermen and learn, more anglers' wisdom. For one, the Ohio Central Basin Steelheaders, which you're one of the founding members, right?
Yep. That was spawned in I think it was right around 1983, 84, the back end of the rod maker's shop. The original owner, Don Gunling, we were affiliated with the Michigan Steelheaders at first because we didn't know what we were doing, Chuck. Didn't have a clue. And then we were going to Michigan for our half annual, biannual and annual meetings. And eventually, a couple of years later, we realized that we're just going to break off on our own, and we tweaked the bylaws and that. And now it's been up and running. We're coming up to 40 years now. So it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's incredible. And if for the people that have never been there, it's a room full of passionate anglers, and they always have a speaker. I know you've spoken a couple. So you're always just hanging out with fishing buddies, talking about fishing and learning stuff. And then you can meet somebody that maybe you can tag along on the river and kind of, help you dial in, or recommend a great guide like Jeff, and dial in the skills. It's definitely something that's been kind of gnawing at me. I don't know, for the past year and a half, maybe even a little bit longer. And I think part of it's because I see all you guys, you and Tom and everybody else out there fly fishing, and even just the random guy, I'm staring at him, trying not to be a creep, but I'm trying to focus on what actually is going on there, and it seems like such a natural way to target fish. I don't know, it's something that I think everybody should check out at some point.
Yeah, if you've got if you have that detail-oriented personality, or let's just say as you're going down your angling career, and you're like, I know if I took a float and a spawn sack or a bead and I ran it through that run, I know I could catch a fish. And you're like, it becomes mechanical, Chuck, right? You're like, oh, and that's how it was with me. You're catching over 1,500 steelhead a year on a gear rod. You're like, well, this is almost mechanical. So how can I make it harder?
Right.
As you got into a tournament, right? So you said, well, I know I can catch these, but how, can I catch them under pressure, and can I compete against some of the best anglers? So that was your next step, right? So it's interesting how each angler evolves, right?
Yeah. It's That's like the best part of it. I mean, you said it best, you don't just get into fishing and give it up. It's kind of like a gang. It's you're in for life.
Yeah, oh yeah. It's a small village. Each, and there's different little villages, right? There's, like yourself, you got the kayak village, you got fly rod villages of this, you got clubs, and it's pretty diverse, but it's very small little villages and tribes.
Yeah. And filled with a bunch of, great people.
Of course.
And aside from like Ohio Central Basin Steelheaders meetings and, hiring a guide like you, there's also classes, I believe, right? By some of the local fly shops and outfitters. They do like casting classes and stuff like that you can, participate in and kind of help dial your skills in. Because, I've heard it. I think Monty Casey was the first person that told me is like, you don't go to the river to fish without dialing in your casting because it's just a disaster, right? So there's that little bit of learning curve on the casting side of things. I think Orvis has some classes maybe.
Oh, yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, all the fly shops have you can take fly casting lessons. You have Orvis, Chagrin River Outfitters, the Backpackers. I teach all the Metro Parks classes, which is a good platform. It's very beginning. We have things called what's called Try It, which means that for $5 you come there, we supply the rods, and you get to whip around a fly rod for an hour. If you like it, then you say, well, I might want to do a 101. But there's all sorts of platforms you can. I'll throw a little plug in is that on May 10th, on the east side of Helen Hazen, which is a park that's off the Grand River, we put together a free, basically all-day fly fishing spay thing, what's called Castapalooza. And that's going to be involved with FFI, Fly Fishers International, and that'll be meet and greet there on May 10th. So that'd be a cool place if you're looking to just say, what the heck is spay, or what the heck can I improve besides the Steelheaders Club? You might want to check that out on May 10th.
Yeah, and Helen Hazen's very beautiful too. It's an awesome park. Even if you don't have a fishing rod in hand, when I used to live out that way, I walked the shoreline or the river, a handful of times, and there's tons of steelhead just sitting right there. So that's a great place. Definitely check that out. And if you get a chance afterwards, if you have a link or something, just shoot it over and I'll put it in the description.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
One thing that I did want to kind of ask, you have all those what looks like awesome books behind you, including one that I've never seen before, that Fishing Encyclopedia, the biggest book on the shelf. I just wanted to ask you, like, if you could pick one of them that you would say had influenced you the most as an angler, and taught you the most, what would that be?
I think, when I started, I started out as a fly angler for, dry fly fishing and stuff on the Asabo, Asabo. So there were some hatch books that really, got me diving into the hatches on the rivers up in Michigan. But I'd have to say, once I dove into the two-handed spay thing, and I'm in it like 365 days a year, there's a couple books, this Al Burr's book, really, really opened my eyes as far as like the casting and the faults and the definitions. And that was one of the very first ones that came out. And it sort of really opened my eyes and was a learning curve for me because my mentors were so far away, and just understanding, because I had no one else to help me realistically. So it was sort of like my mentors, and then eventually, everything started growing. But at first, that book about casting two-handed rods really helped me out.
That's interesting. That's pretty great. I'm a student in life, so any kind of book, anything that I can gain a little bit more knowledge on an interesting subject, I'm all for it. So
right.
So How do your strategies adapt between warm water and cold water? I know we talked about that a little bit as far as the steelhead are concerned, but are you using kind of like the same thing with the other species
Um,
as far as like your depths and stuff?
yep. So the first thing that as a guide is, I hate to say it, is that, our report card is this, grip and grin or a fish in the water, because, they're not going to go back to the office or go back to their buddies and, say, oh, that was a beautiful kayak trip with Chuck, or that was a beautiful boat ride with Jeff. Realistically, we are fishing guides.
Right.
So I as a guide, I have to, first off, if it's a first timer, I have to evaluate skill set and expectations on the angler and expectations on my guiding skills, to put them in a position that they're not uncomfortable with, like trying to make them cast 60 feet when they can't, or fishing 25-foot deep when they can only cast 30 feet. So that's that first little initial meet and greet, and I get on the water, is really key for me, right? I say, hey, we do a little fishing, we get to know each other, we make a few casts, and then once I evaluate their, sort of their skill set, then I prepare for battle, knowing that. And I know not to give them a really big, giant, heavy sinking line. I can do some tricks to make the learning curve easier, so it's not like I'm never want to touch a fly rod again with Jeff. So I try to strive on that. And I've based my guiding operations understanding that I'm the only one out there doing it. There's a few other guides that do it, but they're just getting into it. But so it's a learning process for me too, Chuck, is understanding, like, how can I make a successful day with a beginning fly angler out at a huge body of water,
Right.
high behind islands or high on the shoreline. I'd love to say that the fish bite really, really well when it's blowing out of the south and the south shores of Lake Erie, but as I know, they bite better when it's blowing, like when you're scared to be out there blowing out of the north up against the south shores, but you can't put a fly angler in that position.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the fun parts of guiding is you know ex- expanding as a guide and just being able to pinpoint those certain intricacies that are going to make the trip that much better. Like when I first started, I would just grab, if we were trolling, I'd grab 2 trolling rods, hand them over to my client, and I'd tell them, like, make sure you can see the tips, keep your eyes on both of them. Here's what we're trying to learn. And, along the way, I realized that's a very challenging situation to be in if you've never dealt with a trolling rod or that situation, or kayak fishing, in general. So, at this point, like I hand them one, and depending on the angler, it could be 10 minutes, it could be, 45 minutes, but they get dialed in on that one rod and they don't have to take their attention away from it, so they can catch those small details, and understand, the rod tip action and all that, the little details to make sure that they're actually doing the right thing. And then I'll give them a second rod to expand upon that and obviously duplicate their chances of hooking up. But it's that's an interesting thing. We should have a long conversation about stuff like that one day, maybe at the next expo.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's the whole thing about understanding water temperatures, and when the species that you're chasing, where would they be in relationship to the spawn, right? Are they going to be pre-spawn, spawn, post-spawn, summer peak? Where are they at in relationship? And then put yourself in a situation where, A, you're going to, make it the easiest for your client to catch a fish, right? And I play the water temperature thing. That's what's sort of nice of fishing St. Clair and Erie, is that I can start in Erie and fish for pre-spawn bass. And then when those fish go on the spawn, I can go way up on the north end of St. Clair, where Lake Huron goes through St. Clair River, and all that cold water comes in, and I'm back on pre-spawn smallmouth. And then I just play the musical chair game of fishing for pre-spawn until they're all done spawning. and then I just drop back onto Erie or go out to the east end up towards New York, the New York PA border. So I'm always playing that magic window of, pre-spawn and then early summer.
That's interesting. So you've guided anglers through some epic battles over the years. What is the most memorable fish fight you've ever witnessed?
Oh, let me think about that. If we're not talking about in Ohio, it would probably be a 26-pound wild steelhead in British Columbia that hit a dry fly. That fish was really angry, and it probably took a swipe at it 5 or 6 times before it finally connected. And then when it did, it was probably, I would say, with 20-pound test tippet, it probably took a little under 15 minutes to get in, but it were some unbelievable runs, like runs that you would never see that in a freshwater steelhead that goes into Lake Erie or even Michigan, because they had the room in the current, right? But that was pretty memorable watching that, because the whole time you're like, that's one thing I will say, that a wild steelhead, from the time you hook it to the time you get your hand around its wrist above its tail, you are never in control. They will fight till they're dead. And you got to be really careful so you don't overplay them. That's why we use, goat rope, really heavy pound test tippet. And that fish never gave up, never gave up. So it was pretty amazing.
Wow. That's good to know. Yeah, that I'm sure that was probably long before the ease of capturing footage, but I can only imagine what that fight looked like.
We get a few of them now, not as many as we used to, but we get a few. I think each fish, you would probably know, it's like same thing. It's like you could catch a 7-pound fish, and everyone has a different personality, just like us. And you could have a 7-pound fish that just sort of comes in lazily, and you could have a 7-pound fish that literally takes you to the cleaners, right? Just like people, they all got different personalities, man.
Yeah, they do, and that's why you don't take the fishing rules that seriously. They're more like guidelines, because they all have different personalities, and just because 80 or 90% are going to do what the book says, you got that 10% that's not. They're going to do the opposite probably, and it might be the type of fish that you're looking for.
Yeah, it's like going to the bar when you were, and you go into the restroom, you happen to bump a big guy, and it's like, it's on, the bully of the bar. He wants to fight anybody. That's the fish that we want to catch.
Exactly. Can you share a story about a time when a new angler you had out had a breakthrough moment on the water?
Yes. So in fly fishing, we talked about the, manipulating the line with the strip. And my communication to both anglers is that they have to sort of remember how they caught that fish, right? So it's like, hey, I was a slow fish, slow this or that. So and I learned just as much from anglers as I do myself telling them, right? But I had an angler that we struggled all day. We talked about the pause, we talked about the strip, and then he finally got it. Like, he understood that when you strip a fly, there's a little trick that you don't keep pressure, like when you're stripping it with your non-dominant hand. You sort of have to keep a little tension with your dominant hand where the line is against the cork. And if you have constant tension on that, when you strip this fly, it sort of just looks like it's not animated, but there's a little slack that every time you strip it, you sort of push the rod towards the fly after you strip, to allow to, like, that slack line that you achieve by pushing the rod forward allows that fly to work back and forth. And, we struggled, and then the light bulb went off. I used every analogy I could. And when it went off, he hooked like 10 in like 30 casts. And it was just like, he sat down and he goes, that was like he's been stripping his trout streamers and not doing well, but just that little epiphany was like, oh, that little rod movement, that's what did it. But it took 4 hours, but we did it.
That's pretty awesome. It's I think we all can relate to that with different aspects of fishing where we just struggle and it feels like you're beating your head against the wall until eventually something clicks or, somebody understands what's going on and is able to break it down. So what's one thing every fly angler should be doing to improve their skills regardless of their experience level?
Well, sort of like you, just like you said, be an information knowledge, as much as you can. Now, we have, you have hardback books. My mind works really good by reading something in print rather than like running through it on my phone or on my computer. But it's like nice to put the hardback in front of you, look at it like maps or whatever. But I would say dive into one aspect of fly fishing. Like around here, it's like I see so many anglers like chase the bite, right? So you chase the bite. They're biting over on the Grand River. So you run from the west side of Cleveland, you run over to the Grand River, and you don't have a clue, but because they're biting there, I say the best advice I give to a fly angler is whatever your home river is or your home waters, learn it inside and out, backwards, forward, get really good at casting. And then every place else you go will come easy because A, your casting will be better because you're practicing. But B, just like if you learn the Vermilion or Rocky River, like inside and out, like me and you do, then you can go to other rivers and simulate those types of runs and type of water, and it'll come together with you you can just walk down that stream blindly and say, oh, I've seen that type of water on my home river. But if you start running around chasing a bite, you're just going to frustrate yourself at first. That's all, Chuck.
Yeah, I agree with that. Because you're pretty much just throwing darts at the wall at that point. You're chasing a bite, but you don't really understand anything about that river or how they're, what's going on, the situation.
Just like troll. Go ahead. I was going to say like a troller, right? You could say, oh yeah, by the way, 65 back with a, with a trolling lure, and I can't duplicate it because it just could be the current, could be just a little bit different speed, could be the pound test. So I just say, find your own bite, right?
Yep. Yeah, use the techniques and implement them to figure it out on your own because there's so many different factors. Like you said, I mean, it could be something as simple as you're using a different rod holder and your rod tip's positioned differently, so you don't actually have that amount of line in the water, or you don't have the right angle, or you're not going the right heading. That's funny. One thing I was going to mention about the book thing, because I was never a very good reader. I mean, I can read, just fine, but 3 sentences into a page in, I'm falling asleep. And then I discovered audiobooks, and eventually Audible. It just fit perfect because I was driving a lot. I was always commuting. And if you are going to chase a bite, you can listen to a couple chapters on the way, and one thing that I learned eventually is, obviously with audiobooks, you're driving, you're not fully paying attention. You're retaining some of it, but it's not going to be the same as obviously reading. But for me, somebody that falls asleep when I'm trying to read an actual book, if I'm listening to the audiobook and following along on a physical book, the amount of knowledge I can retain is it's phenomenal because, I have 2 sensors. There's really no way to distract me from the information I'm trying to get, right? But, just a couple suggestions for those that kind of cringe when they hear reading.
Or a podcast like this, right?
Or a podcast like this. There's lots of great podcasts out there. I believe you actually do one as well, right?
I do. I'm affiliated with Wet Fly Swing, which is underneath Dave Stewart's umbrella. But yeah, I do. And it's a great platform. I wish I had it when I was young, but there was no such thing. But the fishing partner, a good fishing partner, is harder to find than a wife. It really is, because the sounding boards that you discuss on the way to your fishing location and on the way home, that knowledge passing back and forth and chit chatting because you're on the water together for so many hours is invaluable. How you figure out the game.
Right. So if you, oh, that's can you guys still hear me okay?
Yeah.
Is it just the camera
There
out
you
there?
go.
I don't know. I didn't even touch it. Sorry about that. If let me find my place again. Oh, there it is. What are the top 3 must-have items every angler should carry with them out there?
I
And I
would,
guess I should specify a fly fishing angler.
yeah, right. I think as a fly angler, as a beginner, I think you should carry a rubber net. Because a lot of times, especially steelhead fishing, and that's where bulk of us are going to be trying to do our startup things, or even on a pond, was where you drag the fish up on the rocks and it's beaten up and down, and you're giving it a mud shampoo and every rock shampoos. And I think a net that way, once you net it, it's easier if you're fishing by yourself. The rubber net keeps it there. You keep it wet, then you can basically tuck your rod in there. So I think a net's pretty important. In not a trout net. I mean, I see a lot of beginning anglers here buy a trout net, which is perfectly fine if you're going for panfish or small bass, but get yourself a legit net that's long enough that when you're by yourself that you can reach out without your rod breaking over, bending, and try to break your rod. So you can reach out and net the fish. A substantial, nice net that's not too heavy. I think the next would be the sunglasses. Not only for eye protection, of course, but I think your eyes are your most important tools for learning, like where to wade, how's your cast, what's going on, but mainly looking through the water. If you're fishing in super, super low light conditions, which we do most of the time here, is the amber lenses or copper lenses are really good to see where the ledges are in the rocks. So that would be a great aid there too. And I think the last one would be to have, rather than getting a box full of flies that say are like, oh, this pattern works. It would be like having a whole bunch of different crankbaits. I feel it's better to stick with very, very few patterns, but get it in some 3 different sizes, basically, because we know the fish sometimes don't want a big bait or a small bait. So if it's a bait fish pattern, rather than making it in, 6 different colors, just buy it in 2 colors, but buy it in 3 sizes, because bait fish are small going to large, right? Depending on the season. So I think that's really important. As you get to these fly bins at the fly shop, or you're looking online and you see all these flies, don't get, like, oh my goodness, like I got to buy all these patterns. Stick with the basics, do your research and get 3 different sizes and maybe only 2, 3 colors at the most.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I agree. I get the question all the time, like, what baits should I buy? Or, like the different colors and stuff like that. Just keep it simple. Buy a couple colors and a few different sizes, because I'm sure you've seen it a million times, just like I have. It doesn't matter if you could use the smallest bait that you have in the box and catch the biggest fish of the day. It just depends on what they're targeting at that moment, and maybe it's just something as simple as like the size of that school of bait fish, or that group of bait fish that's in the area. What's one question you wish people would ask you more often about fly fishing?
Oh boy, let me think about that one. I would think they would say, what is the best way for me to advance in my fly fishing skills? right? I think they always want to say like, hey, where to go, like draw me the X on the spot of like spot drop, like, oh, chasing that bite like we talked about. But I think it was just like, give me a really good baseline of what to expect in this geographic area and how do I get started in doing it. And I give them like an 8-step thing, like do this, do this, do this, and do that. And then like, okay, you're ready to roll.
I like that. That's a great question, and it changes their thought process, and their mindset. You're not chasing a bite. If you focus on improving your techniques, you're gonna catch more fish. You don't have to chase the bite. You don't have to run across the country. You can catch them wherever the closest, most convenient place is once you refine those techniques and the angler's knowledge. So I have a couple rapid fire fun questions, just kind of real quick, and then I got a couple more questions for you, and then we'll kind of wrap up.
Sure, man.
So, what's the biggest fish you caught?
Oh, I don't know, about 100, I think 190-pound tarpon.
Oh, on a fly.
No, on gear.
Ah, nice. Favorite fly fishing destination outside the Great Lakes?
I am a steelhead junkie, so I would say any new waters that have possibilities of catching a steelhead, and it doesn't have to be trophies. It has to be a challenging water with some type of like thought process of how to get in there or how to approach it. It's just the whole planning the trip. But remote drop in on a raft on the Inkland River or something like that. That's sort of that would be my bucket list, like for me.
Speaking of bucket lists, is there a bucket list fish you haven't caught yet?
I am not a bucket list or a headhunter, man. If you told me, Chuck, that I've got a golf course pond that has 10-inch bluegills in it and I've never been there, I would be cool with that. Um, I just like new water that challenges me, that makes me put on my thinking cap and saying, hey, that's even if they're 5-inch bluegills. I've never seen that water before, but I don't have many bucket lists. I guess the bucket list for me would be learning my Great Lakes even better and working on my skills. I think that's my driving force now, is to say that, I know I can go to, you know, Colchester Reef, or I can go over here and I've never been there. How do I approach it? But just learning my home waters even better.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. There is certain species I have on my bucket list, like a tarpon, just for, I don't know. I want to get up close and personal with that fish. It's not even necessarily about the size or anything like that. And when I was putting this episode together, one of the fishing adventures that popped in my head, because you had mentioned something about the importance of like just the water and the challenge and stuff like that, versus like trophy fish or numbers or any of the other stuff. And it reminded me of last summer when Amadeo was visiting from Italy. We went out to my daughter's graduation party, and after about an hour, we stepped outside, and I ended up finding this it was like a little tiny creek inflow, just a perfect setup. But unfortunately, I took all the gear out of the truck, except for I did have one travel rod with me, and I found just a random treble hook. I think it was, like a stinger hook. So I broke the other 2 points off to make a hook small enough, because there was a bunch of creek chubs, and I mean, they weren't real big, but hey, let's see if we can catch them. What do we have to do, right? So modified the gear, and then you had to go find some bait. So you're flipping over rocks and looking for whatever you can put on there, and we ended up catching fish, and it was probably some of the most rewarding catches just because of the process.
Right, man. It's all about the adventure.
Mm-hmm. So fly tying or fishing, if you could only do one of them for 1 year, which would it be?
It would be the fly fishing over the tying.
Yeah.
Yeah. I tie out of necessity.
Right. Right. Yeah. Fly tying, and I don't tie flies, but I've been messing around with tying like rope flies for gar. But it's one of those things that you do when you can't get out on the water or everything's frozen, you know. It's it just kind of helps fill that void a little bit, right?
For sure.
And what's one word to describe your perfect fishing day?
My perfect fishing day is early in the morning, fish dark to dark, work my ass off, and land one fish.
Right.
That's my perfect day. I
I
don't
like
need to. I don't like to mow them out of there. But I worked and figured out the game to get that one fish.
And the amount of knowledge that you walk away with on a day like that is just phenomenal.
For sure.
It's you know, I always tell my clients, you know, on the good fishing days, they're kind of getting robbed a little bit because they're not getting all those, you know, intricate lessons of like switching over and trying to dial it in to figure out like what the hell's going on today. You know, it's kind of puts things into perspective because you realize like only on the days that you struggle the hardest do you walk away with the biggest prize ever, right? And that's the knowledge.
So true, man.
So what do you hope our listeners take away from this episode about the key principles and insights behind your approach to build a safer, more effective angling experience?
You know, I think if they're listening, I think don't be afraid to, dabble into the fly fishing world. Don't like dive in head first. I think, start in slow, use your conventional gear or your tactics that you're using now as a crutch. Go to an area that if you get the fish going, pull out the fly rod a little bit, see if you can catch them on the fly rod and say, okay, I get this game. And then if you fall on your face, go back to conventional gear. But don't make it to the point where you make it unpleasurable, Chuck. Make it a fun process, a learning process. Challenge yourself, man.
Yeah, that's great advice. And what was it? The last couple of episodes we talked about some of that stuff. You know, just go out and have fun, right? You know, have fun, and embrace the suck and look for the silver lining. You know, if you don't catch fish, hey, it took a while in my angling career, and you know, before I started doing this full time, to realize that what I take away when I don't do very good or when I struggle or when I'm fishing a new place and it kicks my butt. You know, it's there's so many different silver linings that make the trip so much more worth it. And I think sometimes we kind of beat ourselves up because maybe we didn't do too good in the tournament or we didn't catch the fish we wanted, you know. But just remember to always focus on those silver linings, right? And before we let you off the hook, we're going to reel you back in for one last piece of angler's wisdom. But don't worry, it's a catch and release type of question. If you had to choose just one or two key pieces of angler's wisdom, whether it's something you learned through experience, a mentor, or a valuable lesson passed down to you, what would they be? And why do you think they're so important for other anglers to hear?
I would think that use every day when you're on the water and challenge yourself to take yourself outside the box and learn another technique. May it be throw a lure that you never used before, use a fly that you never used before, try swinging a fly rather than using an indicator, try using this. So I think open yourself up to expansion, but not like, oh, I'm going to do this all day. Just use it a little bit of the time and use baby steps. And then you can use that as a platform to grow your knowledge very, very quickly rather than just saying, I'm going to do this. And then you sort of get frustrated that day. So that's challenge yourself, change up tactics at least once a day. And then I would think the next thing would be is do homework. So many of my trips is not looking at the weather that you're going to be fishing that day in the morning. Of course, we do that because we've got to deal with Mother Nature kicking us in the stomach that day or not a nice sunny day. But I look at the weather patterns, what was happening a week before I get there. Like what happened to the ecosystem before I get there? Is it going to be muddy because or the weeds are up off the bottom? But do your homework because a lot of anglers aren't blessed like Chuck, you and I, Chuck. We, my fingers on the pulse 7 days a week, 220 days on the water. So as a casual angler, doing some couch fishing while you've got the baby, giving the baby the bottle and just saying, hey man, this water has been really looking like it's been really high and muddy, and do that research in advance.
Yeah, that's great advice, Jeff. And I mean, it could be anything as simple as just listening to or looking at forums or watching the gauges, or if there's a live camera or anything like that, paying attention to that stuff. It just starts to build that understanding where it kind of makes you a better angler when you get there, right? It's like what they say, trophies are earned during practice. They're just picked up on tournament day, so to speak, or, fishing day. Yeah, that's great advice. Well, that's the last question I had for you. Did you have anything else that you wanted to touch on?
I think we covered a whole bunch of stuff. I think we got into the weeds a little deep for the whole two-handed thing. It's hard to explain it without being on the water, but
right.
I think we're cool, Chuck. I really can appreciate you having the invite, man. It's super sweet.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you joining us. One thing I did want to mention before we go, coming up, I think in less than a month, is the 10th annual Barbie Steelhead Derby, which it started out a decade ago. One of the local anglers needed, he was having a rough time, and people put this together. But since then it has evolved into a way that makes like those $5 classes, the fly fishing stuff, it makes it possible for the community through the Cleveland Metro Parks. So if you're not doing anything on that Saturday, I'm at a loss for words for the date. I'm thinking of because I'm doing a podcast before the week before. Is it the 27th?
Sounds familiar. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's end of the month down on Rocky River. So definitely head over to the Cleveland Metro Parks website, check that out. And I highly recommend, even if you don't go fish, they have a raffle. Many of us in the fishing community, we donate to help raise funds because, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the community. What the Cleveland Metro Parks and the people within it do is they make it easy for people to get into this sport that we all love, right? So, make it a point to check it out and maybe invite a friend if they've never experienced it. And going back to the challenging thing, I mean, you're catching a steelhead on a Barbie fishing rod or a Spider-Man fishing rod, so it is quite a challenging situation. And you never know when the river conditions are going to be. I know some years it's been pretty crappy, other years it's been pretty great. So it's just an opportunity to get out and experience something new, support the community, meet some fellow anglers. I think he does. Yeah, they do food and stuff like that. And like I said, there's all kinds of awesome raffle prizes that you can get in on. So definitely check that out. And if you're anywhere near the Akron area, I'm heading to the JDM Fishing and Outdoor Expo this weekend. From Friday through Sunday. I'll have the booth set up and I'll be on stage. I believe Friday is 3 p.m., Saturday is 2 p.m., and Sunday is noon. just talking about kayak fishing and the thrill and what you can experience. So definitely check that out. And then we will be back next Thursday. Next Thursday will be an early episode. We're bringing on Captain Jules, and you know, she's like most of us anglers. You got to go to bed early to get up early to get to the water and to get out there and do your guided trips and stuff like that. So we're doing a little bit early show. Next week's episode will air at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then we'll kick back to the 8 p.m. format. So we will see you next Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Angler's Wisdom podcast. Thanks for joining in, guys. And get out there and catch some fish. Thank you for joining us today on the Angler's Wisdom podcast. We hope you got some good insight out of the show and learned something new. Don't forget to go over to ampedoutdoors.com and support the title sponsor of the show. Follow them on social media and just show them some love. And lastly, head over to LakeErieKayakFishing.com and check out all the many resources as well as opportunities to book an unforgettable Lake Erie kayak fishing adventure with yours truly. You can also get yourself a Lake Erie kayak fishing gift card to the obsessed angler in your life. And remember, fishing is life, but safety comes first. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next Thursday live on the Angler's Wisdom podcast.
Oh, yeah! Yeah! Oh! Oh, it's a nice one. Yeah!